Well, welcome everyone. We're going to get started. Uh, my name is Anyanyam Joe. I'm a senior research officer at the Ethics Lab where we're hosting this webinar. Just some housekeeping rules at the beginning about how SOLVE is going to proceed, and then I'm going to introduce, uh, say a bit more about the lab, our speakers, and we'll get started. So first of all, this event is going to be recorded and archived. So if you would not like, if you want to ask a question but wouldn't like to be seen, please keep your question make use of the chat room to ask your questions. If you don't mind being seen when you are asking a question, please just introduce yourself prior to starting off. So the Ethics Lab is really a platform where we bring the humanities and the technological developments at the frontier of science into conversation around ethics. We are particularly interested in the ethics of new and emerging health technologies, but more generally, we want to create a platform and a community for the assertion of a collective agency. We are African-centered in this orientation, and the long-term hope is that we are able to bring together and nurture a thriving network of scholars from Africa and also elsewhere who want to, leverage the humanities, the African humanities, to think about the ethical questions posed by new and emerging health technologies. So this webinar, this online platform that we're currently curating is one of the activities we're doing to foster that environment. We also have academic retreats. Our research development program also includes residencies, so international exchanges, whether that's some of our team working with others on the continent and abroad, or whether that's other scholars coming here to the University of Cape Town and working with us to pursue questions, lines of inquiry that are relevant to the kind of work that we are doing. Today's webinar is inspired by a very important question that has sort of been a staple in the African studies community. It's inspired by Amina Mama's essay, "What is it ethical to study Africa?" where she goes through some of the intellectual and some of the ethical commitments that have sort of shaped progressive intellectuals on the continent. And so really, I'm excited to invite our speakers to probe this question further as it relates to global health and discourses around emerging technologies. I'm curious to see the kinds of priorities and questions that they inspire us to ask around thinking about ethics, technology, and health from an African-centered perspective. So our first speaker is Amina Suleimani. She's a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for Humanities in Africa. Her research is at the intersection of artificial intelligence, care, hospital futures, and all this with a particular focus on access to cancer treatment. Our second speaker is Henri Michel Yere. He's from the University of Basel. He's a historian interested in global health and global governance, decolonization, as well as the categories by which we engage Africa in the conduct of genomic science. And our concluding speaker is going to be Dr. Caesar Atwire, who is affiliated with the University of Ghana, Legon, and University of Oxford. And his research leverages Afro-communitarian insights in prevailing bioethics questions, with a particular emphasis on developing a pluriversal account of solidarity in global health. So I will pass over now to Amina. Each speaker is going to have 15 minutes. All speakers will present, and then we'll move into a question and answer session. Thank you. Amina, over to you.
Thank you so much, Anye. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to you, Anye. Thank you to the team at the Neuroscience Institute for organizing this talk. I'm really delighted to be part of it. I was actually very intimidated to be speaking next to Prof. Atwir and Prof. Yeri. So thank you for the opportunity. I don't have slides, so please bear with me. In this presentation, I'm really relying on some provisional thoughts from my current doctoral research. And so there is a particular question that I wish to begin with, which is, can Africa still be a living laboratory? So this question is inspired or taken from the title of Helen Tilly's book, Africa as a Living Laboratory, Empire, Development, and the Problem of Scientific Knowledge, which kind of historically traces and examines whether modern Western science was responding to African problems and the hegemony and the role of science in transforming the health of African subjects under colonial rule. So I think if we were to borrow the phrase, the idea of Africa as a laboratory, I believe continues, this question or phrase really continues under the conversation of technology and innovation under different imperial forces that have used more or less the same modes of resource extraction across the continent. And so a large part of my thinking actually began as I was thinking about Morocco, the space in which I did my fieldwork, and also thinking along with France's presence in Morocco as Morocco's ex-colonizer. And I had the question of, to what extent is the current French neo-colonial but larger global capitalist project underestimating the possibility for local production and for the potentialities of African epistemes to shape this new postmodern, post-human realities? And in what ways are governments empowering local technological advancements, if at all? And so during my recently finished fieldwork in Morocco, I spent a significant amount of time with software engineers who were developing artificially intelligent algorithms, both for health and for other industries. And questions of ethics and morality rarely came through, in that for them, the purpose was functionality. Ethics is the sprinkle you perhaps add on top to ensure that the data is secured or anonymized, and they were very upfront about it. So in responding to the question of whether is it ethical to study Africa, Prof. Amina Mama stresses that ethical questions must arise at all levels of the research process, since the researcher is bound or committed at least to solving a particular solution or a particular problem that is situated and contextualized in a specific space. And I wish, I'm saying this with the wish that these theoretical conversations could also take place within engineering labs. And so along with the people I was doing research with, when we spoke about ethics, the ethics of their smart engines, we turned to moral philosophy. But actually to realize that not all the engineers in the room could find the link between what they were building and ethics and the kind of ethics to uphold in the process. And so we ended one of those conversations with the idea that perhaps a starting point could be for them to understand how their smart agents could potentially reproduce new forms of systemic inequalities. These sort of conversations across disciplines, me as being someone doing ethnographic fieldwork in an AI lab, brought me a lot of uncomfort and discomfort, mainly by virtue of my inability to see what the engineers or the radiophysicists, which I did research with later, were seeing, which I wasn't seeing. But to quote Prof. Francis Nyamjo, to be blinded by sight, by what one assumes they know, or in this instance, what I couldn't see, what we can see as people going from the humanities to AI labs or engineering lab, shouldn't prevent us from engaging through interdisciplinary discourses and co-creating meaning and questions around what kind of futures are being built through new biotechnologies. And so I think I kept and I keep thinking along with along with the idea of dependency, and dependency has been one of the biggest ripple effects of the fourth industrial revolution. The dependency in how health infrastructures are being built across the continent. Several of Morocco's future hospitals are being built by France, and I think it's the same case in Mali and Niger. So what used to be an occupied territory, a colony, remains under technological advancement today, a space from which flows of data and blood travel, but the bodies remain in place, governed by regulations on their mobility. So I want to give two examples of the relationships of neo-colonial dependency that are lived out in relation to biotechnologies, which are coming from my fieldwork. So the first example is with one interlocutor who was a young business developer of a health tech startup. He was incredibly excited about the intelligent ultrasound his local team of Moroccan engineers developed through a deep learning algorithm to prevent birth defects and preterm births. He tells me, this is a product we want to export to African countries and we really want to lead through it. Him and his team were yet to get ethical clearance from the National Commission of Data Protection and yet to conduct clinical trials. Where? In the US. He tells me, open quote, it's better and it would validate our competence, end of quote. But according to him, that wasn't the only issue. In a space with a high level of state surveillance like Morocco, he felt unsafe, surveilled, and tracked. The solution to getting a place in the market was to actually get a robust and solid funding from either Silicon Valley or the United States, a funding like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So throughout the research, I actually got to understand that there was much more pressure on local developers to follow a thorough step-by-step ethical clearances in contrast with the traveling foreign health softwares that empower radiotherapy machine or cancer diagnosis, for instance, which are bought and put in place in oncology clinics. What the moral characters of such technologies is probably a question that a government officer signing the paperwork for a potential partnership doesn't necessarily ask. So the neo-colonial dimension of this ripple effect translates to the accumulation of large banks of data overseas about African subjects, which are later fed to algorithms and developed biotechnology softwares that return to the continent and become sold as commodities and place themselves as the primary reliable infrastructure for excellence and accuracy when it comes to health and wellness. And as someone coming in from the humanities, I grapple with trying to understand how these systems work. But inevitably, I think I really found myself in reality questioning how did these things come to be? And why is it that the development of the new modern Moroccan hospital, like I mentioned, is handed to French firms? And what is happening is that they are replacing the old colonial hospital with the modern one, but it's the same sort of power and hegemony that is rebuilding it. Or perhaps that clinical trials are shipped to a place like the United States. And sort of just having questions on what kind of repositories of knowledge will the data collected from the Moroccan hospitals, for instance, that would be gathered by the engineers who will develop the algorithmic infrastructure of the hospitals. What kind of repositories of knowledge will it sit in, and who would engage it, and what will it be used for? The idea that the footprint of the algorithm is indeed in virtual numbers sits in physical space and in a data center, who knows where, is also really relevant to think with. And so the second example that I wish to give is a conceptual one. A new avenue which I have taken is looking at the post-phenomenological, which is really the machine-human interaction. and to take a stance as a researcher to refuse that the idea that it's too early to think of researching the impact of technologies on human life on the continent. The imaginary that we are situated in the past of the quote-unquote global north was a common idea I encountered during my research, and one which I continue to think with, and of how this temporal glitch continues to fuel an unquestioned techno-solutionism and optimism that we want to reach the modernity of the quote-unquote global north, that we want to be part of the future and escape the past in which we are currently living in. In one of the cases in my research, I sat along with radiophysicists, and these are the people who create treatment plans for radiotherapy machines in a cancer clinic for cancer patients. And they were very excited about this new machine that they've been working with. It's been built since 2019, and it's an American innovation that sits in a Moroccan private clinic, and there's only one like it in the continent. And so the ways in which they interacted with it was very interesting for me to observe. So it had a component that had an artificially intelligent dimension, which is adaptive cancer treatment. And in one of the conversations that have come up, the question of responsibility came up. And for them, the fact that they relied on technology meant that there was accuracy, and it actually relieved them as radiophysicists from needing to conduct a new set of measurements or add another layer of interaction with the patients. And this made me think about this desired disengagement from responsibility. Where does it actually come from? But how it actually deeply challenges the cultural fabric of our Moroccan sociality and for care that patients of oncology often expect, and whose absence actually amplifies feelings of neglect, regardless of how smart the machine is. There is an Italian philosopher that I like to think with called Rossi Braidotti. And she's arguing that what we need in a post-human world, a world mediated with technologies, is what she called a shift in values that center affirmation as opposed to techno-optimism. But how affirmation is an avenue for critical conversations as opposed to adopting techno-optimism, which could eventually blind us from seeing the shift in modalities of capitalism in order to redefine who we are becoming as individuals. And I can't not think that trust and care are central to feminist ethics in research as in practice. Prof. Amina Mama and other feminists contests actually the neoliberal discourses that privilege the role of the market in driving developments, which I think poses huge limitations to freedom over bodies and the right to health, but also well-being. And so lastly, I think for me, understanding the underpinnings of the coloniality of being is a starting point for refusal, but also for possibilities in which collective solidarity and resource ownership of data, blood, and biotechnologies are locally governed, whether that takes place in Morocco, Kenya, or Namibia. And I think it's both a question of decolonization, just as much of decoloniality, of both territoriality and the individual. Both being possible avenues for critical conversations as opposed to techno-optimism that blind us, as I mentioned, from seeing the ripple effects of the fourth industrial revolution. I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, Anye. I'm really sorry, but I just have two last questions that I wanted to share, which are questions I'm still grappling with. The first one is, what does ethical resistance mean in the context of African health when the biotechnologies are interwoven in large networks characterized by opacity? The opacity through which the system function can only enable us to ask the questions that we deem as relevant to what we see, or disciplines from which we're observing. And is it possible to see much larger than ourselves and probe new questions as a collective? And I think this space really speaks to that. And the second question is, in what ways could the politics of solidarity support the framing of health technologies in ways that advance freedom and human dignity? I'll stop here. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Amina. We'll now, yeah, thank you. Sorry, my camera wasn't on. Thank you very much, Amina. We're now going to move to Dr. Henri Michel.
Hi. Can you actually see me?
No, I can't.
Because it might have to be this way because for some reason my camera does not want to show me. So I need to apologize for this because yeah, technology. So I'm going to be speaking to you from Basel. Anya, I would like to thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this exciting exchange. So I'm going to speak to you from a paper that I have been sort of thinking about for a while, which I called How to Learn from History, Ethics as a Possibility. And so it is important maybe that I say before I start that I'm an historian by training, because this may have an influence on the ways in which this conversation is being framed from my perspective. So famously, Hegel once said that humans did not learn anything from history, coming from the perspective that historical events had a way of repeating themselves that could only testify to the fact that they were not actually the basis for any kind of learning towards changing human action at a societal level. Well, I tend to not necessarily to agree with this when I pay attention to certain events that took place, notably from an ethical perspective. And one event in particular that kept my attention in the context of this reflection is the Nuremberg trials, particularly the doctors' trials. Nuremberg, of course, is considered one of the high points, or maybe the origin of what is known today as bioethics. So particularly the Nuremberg Code, which is a set of ideas that came out of the trial that was actually formulated by the judges when they passed judgment onto the doctors that they judged for the atrocities that they carried in Germany and the rest of Europe during the height of the Nazi regime before and during the Second World War. So we're talking a time starting in the 1930s right down to the late 1940s or so. And what is fascinating about the Nuremberg Code is that the basic principle that the code paused is the notion of voluntary consent on the part of the human subject who is undergoing an experiment. So this idea has become a central point in any kind of experiment that's being conducted today at a scientific and a medical level. Clinical trials particularly refer to this notion of voluntary consent as being essential to their possibility to carry out their experiments on people, that people should accept and be conscious and well informed of what is going to happen before they get engaged into these experiments. So the way I tend to look at the existence of this code is that it is an attempt to learn from history, because obviously what was characteristic of the experiments that were being carried out during the Nazi time was that the subjects that were involved were not involved on a voluntary basis. And so obviously that had the tragic consequences that we know. And so to me, when I look at that particular decision that was taken by the US American judges, because it was a trial conducted by a set of judges deployed by the United States of America as those that had won the war on the Western Front, I see it as an attempt to say we're looking back to a historical moment in which we have seen things have gone horribly wrong. And we're trying to not just make amends, but we're wanting to make sure that this should not actually happen again. So we're basically actively learning from that particular historical experience. And why do I talk of a historical experience? It is also because of the scope that this experience has taken, because these principles were not just adopted for them to operate in Germany or in Europe or in the United States, but they were seen to hold value that is deemed universal, although that term, of course, invites a whole other debate that I do not want to open here at this point, but I just want to use that word for the purposes of expressing the notion that when that code was adopted, it was seen to have implementation everywhere at all times. A little along the lines of the term universal that was used in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which came out a few years afterwards in 1948. And so as I look at this, I ask myself, to what extent can we learn from a particular historical experience? And in this context, I want to bring to the fore what I call the African historical experience. Now, this is a vast term. Now, what do you mean when you say African history? What are you talking about? Are you talking about, I mean, when did African history start? Which particular episode do you have in mind? What particular country do you face? Are you including the diaspora? And all of these questions, I will leave them open on purpose, because I think this is a part of why this conversation can become interesting. And so, but where do I come from? Why do I ask this question? And I'm going to tell you where this question comes from at a very personal level. So as you were introducing me, Anya, you mentioned the fact that I have done work with in the area of genomics in Africa, together with Yantina, who's on this call. We've done this type of work indeed with other colleagues as well, Mavis Mashirori, notably among others. And one thing that struck me when talking to scientists that are involved in the work of genomics, so geneticists, biologists, medical doctors, it is also maybe useful at this point to explain that I have had before being an academic at the University of Basel, I've worked in the pharmaceutical industry myself. And I have then known colleagues who are working in this area as well. One thing that struck me was the fact that the type of research that was being conducted on these large-scale research projects on the continent of Africa did not originate from preoccupations that were tied to particular either needs or even epistemological questions coming out of African concerns. In other words, the scientists were doing work along the lines of the type of work that had been done already in North America, and that work had been developed under the aegis of the Human Genome Project, which was presented to us as one of the biggest scientific projects of the late 20th century, early 21st century. And so that struck me because I saw colleagues based on the African continent who are as competent as the colleagues in North America and in Europe that have similar training, similar degrees, that publish papers in similar journals. Yet when it came to producing the types of questions that were going to lead research projects, it seemed as if, in spite of the clear equality in competence, the African colleagues were not invited to propose those kinds of questions, and the questions stemmed from other spaces. And so I started to ask myself the question, but why is it that the possibility for questions to come out of Africa is not even considered in the first place? And so obviously one of the answers could be those who finance the research are those that are going to decide what the research is about. But I thought maybe this answer was an easy one. It's too obvious to be the only answer, so I've decided to take the answer to another level, and that's the level of understanding whether science, as it is produced on the continent of Africa, as it is being researched on the continent of Africa, was at all connected to a sense of African history, in the sense that we are part of a particular narrative, and that the research that we're conducting is actually in line with that particular narrative or not. So this is basically where the question comes from in the first place. Now, obviously, African history, and I'm going to be a little more specific now. I see that time is running. What has happened in the course of African history is that Africans from the diaspora, as well as from the continent, have produced what are called historical critiques. And the historical critiques that they have produced centered around the treatment that was reserved to African humanity in the course of particular episodes, such as the transatlantic slave trade or the colonial experience. And those critiques are well known. Anti-colonial resistance, for instance, is one of those critiques. Negritude in literature is another one of those critiques that came out of 1930s Paris, taken up by the voices of Leopold Senghor, Aimé Césaire, and Léon Damas. And these voices were centered on the idea that it was primordial to affirm the humanity of African people. And of course, negritude has been critiqued by people like Achille Mbembe, who said that the attitude of the intellectuals of the 1930s, who were reclaiming the humanity of Africans, was paradoxically enough resting on themes that were put forward by those who denied that humanity. So, for instance, the idea that, well, we are Africans and we scream in anger, and we actually welcome that scream, and we welcome that notion of savagery that is attributed to Africans as being something that is part of what makes us strong. So this idea of taking up the topos that was brought forward by those I called Africans inhuman and turning it into a supplementary sign of humanity, a strength, and something that was useful for Africans to affirm their humanity, was being critiqued by people like Mbembe. Pan-Africanism has been another one of those critiques. Pan-Africanism, of course, originates from the diaspora. So in those critiques that I have cited, what strikes me personally when I look at them a little closer is that I do not see that they seek to answer the question from the perspective of science as such. They are preoccupied with a political agenda. Pan-Africanism, for instance, is tied to the birth of the Organization of African Unity, itself to the birth of the African Union. Anti-colonial resistance had assigned itself the aim of bringing about independence. Independence somehow has arrived, although we all know independence is grossly incomplete. Many of these conversations would not take place if we were convinced that Africa and African countries were effectively independent. The only person, well, not the only one, but the voice that came out of those years, because I'm proceeding to a historical analysis, with a specific scientific agenda, seeking to overturn the conversation on science, is that of Cheikh Anta Diop, the Senegalese historian, linguist, chemist, etc., savant. And so, in spite of that, as I look at the work of Diop, I'm not certain as to whether Diop has produced a body of work that sought to answer the question of what I call an ethics. Because what I'm referring to here as an ethics is not so much the classical notion of an ethics as we understand it from a philosophical perspective. But what I'm really talking about here is the capacity to exert epistemological autonomy on the part of African thinkers and particularly scientists in a way that is comfortable and that does not seek to affirm itself as a confrontational, as a counterforce, or as something that is against something else, but that has the self-assurance of having internalized its own historical paradigms. And so I obviously do not have an answer to these questions. So I would leave you with a summary of these ideas in the form of questions. And my hope in talking to you about these ideas is, of course, to bring about a conversation around what I have said. So who has the power to decide which event should carry enough historical credence in order to command the ushering in of novel paradigms? The second question would be, what does it take to consider one's own history as a site for drawing some of the moral arc of what it means to be human? And the third question would be, which elements of African history could serve as a base in order to project an ethics whose reach would address the entirety of humankind? Hoping to have made sense to you. I'm looking forward to our next speaker and to engaging with you at a later stage this afternoon. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Henri. Really grateful for the journey into African history as generative of all these questions that you've posed. Over to you, Caesar.
Excellent. Thank you, Anye. Could you share my slides, please, while I get ready? I think yes. Are you sharing them?
Yes.
Good. Excellent. So yeah, without the introduction, you can move on to the next slide. So yes, I think my talk follows a little bit from what we've just heard from Amina and Henri. And the whole project of the ethics lab at UCT, I think, falls into this notion of, Africa as a place of knowledge. And that's why I've decided to put this image of the globe to kind of remind us that, there are many ways of looking at the world, and we are quite used to, through our education, to looking at the north always on top and the south at the bottom. But that is arbitrary. It can actually be seen in different ways. And looking at things from this perspective could also offer new insights into the way we understand the world in which we live and how we ought to move in it. But I just wanted to start off with these 3 points that I've put on the slides as a premise, and then move on to the discussion of what Africa can contribute to the current ethical discourse. Following a little bit from what Henri said, one of the interesting things we find when we start thinking about, looking at African scholarship, is that there is a phase in the history of African scholarship, particularly from last century, that I call a phase of apologia, which is a phase of like trying in defense of, in ancient Greek, apologia, and also in Latin is a writing or a narrative to almost justify oneself. So in a trial, for example, you had the categoria, which was the accusation, and then the apologia would be the defense. And most of the literature and the thinking that we see among early African scholars, above all, was to counter the narrative that, well, Africans did not have literature, Africans do not have history, Africans do not have philosophy, and so on. And so a lot of our early production, which we see even in texts like Achebe, Achebe narrates the stories around the Igbo people, but there are explanations that are included in the way he narrates these stories, especially for a foreign a foreign reader who doesn't understand the context. So we're constantly trying to justify. If you look in the discipline of philosophy, you look at the works of Wiridu, you look at the works of Abraham, you look at the works of Jeche, and the interesting thing is that quite often these works are premised by, first of all, just trying to justify that we do have a philosophy, and then after that, presenting that philosophy. What I would like to say today is that basically that era of apologia is over. There is no need to justify to anybody. If we continue to move on the pathway of always trying to justify. So now we're going to talk about ethics. So we're going to talk about how to justify an African ethic, especially to the external gaze, which responds to what Paulin Hontoji talks about when he talks about extraversion. We're always trying to produce knowledge in ways that will be acceptable to a certain standard that has been created. And that is not wrong, but it belongs to a certain phase. And we've now matured, I think, over that phase. Because yes, in philosophy, which is my discipline, at the beginning with Placide Temples, the whole idea was, do Africans have a philosophy or not? Who is the African Socrates? Who is the African Plato? But we no longer need to engage in that sort of a conversation. We do have a philosophy, it exists, there is a body of knowledge, and let's move on. And that will also save us from always trying to look for recognition from outside, falling back on Huntonji, in order to, as it were, approve the work that we're doing. So that is the first premise. The second premise is that in today's world, knowledge from Africa ought to have clear citizenship. Even if it is just a question of numbers, if there are 8 billion people in the world, 1.5 billion of them live on the African continent across 54 countries. These are people who are thinking, people who are living, and they produce knowledge. And this knowledge, even if it is just for the sake of numbers, has citizenship, just like any form of knowledge. And this is important, and we need to, affirm that. And this citizenship, interestingly, we do not need to request it from anybody. It is not citizenship that is granted. It is citizenship that just is. When you're born into a country, you don't need to apply to become a citizen. We are born into this world. We live in this world. This continent is in this world. The population of the continent is in this world. And therefore, this group of people has citizenship. And the knowledge they produce is part of the body of knowledge that belongs to the world. And it is interesting that quite often, and especially in academia, when you write papers to publish, especially in high-ranking journals, the kind of, reviews that you receive, if this has already been explored by authors from Canada or from the US or from Germany, why do we need an African vision? Whenever I receive these type of reviews, I simply say, well, because Africa is here to stay, and just learn to live with it. That's it. I don't need to even justify that because other people have said it. I cannot say it from an African voice. And the third point that I would like to make is that, and this is a point that is directed more towards us as the community of African scholars, is that in order to affirm Africa as a place of knowledge, we need a form of commitmental engagement. And when I talk about commitmental, I'm borrowing from a term that the Ghanaian philosopher Kwame Gyekye uses when he talks about, in terms of like decolonial engagement with our own people. If we do not, and I also put the word seriousness into parentheses, because if we want to generate knowledge, this knowledge has to be serious. And jokingly, one of the things I found when I started teaching at the University of Ghana was that whenever you said I said something, the students would say, like, they would answer, oh, are you serious? Like, seriously? No, we are serious. Seriousness is not something to joke about. And therefore, this places an onus on African scholars, which is a double onus. One is to be very competent. And then secondly, the commitmental engagement means to avoid repeating what, to some extent, Henri mentioned in his submission earlier on. And this idea is actually articulated well in the works of Ayikwe Ama, the Ghanaian novelist, in his book, The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born. Sometimes when intellectuals on the African continent are fighting for this form of citizenship, we are not fighting for a citizenship that will actually engage the community, but we are fighting for the rights of an African elite. And this African elite does not really feel even accountable to the populations of the countries in which we live, which has been the story of the independence movement. Basically, we shifted the colonials out, but the intelligentsia or the elite went and occupied the position of the colonials and continued perpetuating the systems of coloniality. So these are the three premises from which I want to start before then I talk about, African and ethics. Next slide, please. So the photograph you see here is the story of a young boy from Ghana who had just one leg, and some Americans wanted to help him, and he said no. What he really wants is to be given a bicycle so that he will ride the bicycle from the northern border to the southern coastal border of Ghana, which is, over 800 miles. And he got this bicycle, and with one leg, he rode all the way from Paga to Tema. And a film was made out of it, and the title of the film was Emmanuel's Gift. So if we're going to use the analogy of Emmanuel's gift to talk about the gift of ethics, the gift of Africa to global ethics, I just want to mention 3 points. There are many, but I just want to highlight 3 because the time is very limited. One of the important things we now need, especially when we're talking about global ethics, is a type of ethics that is capable of dealing with wicked problems, because the problems that the world is going to have to deal with, and we're currently dealing with, are problems that are multi-layered, they are complex, and no one can solve them alone. We've also realized, and earlier on it was mentioned about the importance of informed consent and individual autonomy in the birth of bioethics. We've also realized that an individual-centered bioethic fails to capture all the problems, the ethical dimensions of the problems that we have to deal with. One of the examples I often give is that, COVID vaccines were created with informed consent and ethical approval, but the distribution was less than ethical. It was anything but ethical. So we need a new framework. When we start thinking about antimicrobial resistance, we need a new framework that goes beyond individual liberties. When we start thinking about climate change, we need better frameworks. So the wealth of knowledge that has been produced by Africans, scholars, especially in the area of philosophy, ontology, personhood, is a relational ontology, which is quite different to, let's say, the Western way of thinking, which comes from the Aristotelian tradition, whereby beings have an essence, they have a substance, an ousia in Greek, and then once they are constituted, then they relate with other beings. So relator, right? There's a being that exists, and then it relates with another being. Here we have something that is totally different that is emerging from the African body of thinking, which is that actually, even before we exist, what actually produces our existence is our relationality. Therefore, we are intrinsically relational beings and essentially relational. And you find that even in Ubuntu philosophy, we become others through others, or you find that in Kenya, in the thinking of Kenyan Mbiti, who talks about the fact that I am because we are, all these things point to a kind of relational conceptualization of reality, which is actually being proven now by science, because as the more we go down and down and down to the genomic levels, we see how interdependent even our constitutions are. Now, it is when we have a relational understanding of reality that we can actually begin to see how we are so our destinies and our lives are so intertwined that if we want to look for an ethic or an ethical framework that aspires to beings that cannot be separated from each other, we need a different type of framing. And like I say, this is not a new idea. Even if we look in the Western tradition, in ancient Greece, we had the tradition of Parmenides and Heraclitus. Heraclitus also brings this same idea of reality being a sort of flux in which we are all immersed. However, the evolution of Western thinking moved more and more away from the Heraclitean tradition, and apart from a few voices, most recently, in the 20th century, or in the 19th and 20th century, we can talk about the works of Nietzsche and the works of Alfred North Whitehead. But what African thinking can do, because African thinking did not follow the same historical journey that Western thinking did, can actually bring back into the debate, which has been forgotten by the mainline thinking, even in ethics and bioethics that we're using, is to recover these lost dimensions. Secondly, and this is a theory that I'm currently working on, is the concept of emergent personhood. Today, our debates are becoming more and more, or understanding what human persons or what persons are is becoming more and more critical. They were already critical when we were debating euthanasia and when we were debating abortion. Now we're going to have to debate this with regard to non-human lives, animals from a One Health perspective, and we're going to have to debate this too from artificial intelligence, social robots that interact with us. So how do we understand what a person is? Mainstream traditional philosophical thinking that we find in many Western textbooks has always looked for intrinsic properties to determine what a person is. The African tradition, on the other hand, looks at relations that actually determine what a person is. And there have been debates between Ifeanyi Menkiti and Kwame Gyekye about to what extent the community and the relations determine who a person is. But at the end of the day, this allows us to constitute a new theory of personhood, which I call an emergent personhood, which means that persons emerge out of relations, but the thing that emerges out of those relations is bigger than the sum of the relations, and therefore has dignity on its own. And it is not only attributed to just humans, but personhood and moral standing can be attributed to non-humans, as we see even in many African traditions, whereby traditionally people have had, given moral standing even to mountains and rivers in their communities. And this opens up a new perspective of thinking about ethics. Final point that I would like to suggest is this: pluriversality as a way of doing ethics. Thanks to coloniality or colonialism, many African countries are a conglomeration of people who come from different ethnic, cultural traditions, sometimes with radical disagreements, and we've been thrown together to form countries and nations. We have a long history of dealing with diversity. And this allows us to be able to think that you can actually arrive at ways of collaborating and ways of having shared ethical goals, even if your worldviews differ. This is not the same tradition that we find in other parts of the world, especially in Europe and America, which to some extent has a universalizing approach to everything, because there is an underlying framework which comes from ancient Rome to the the medieval Christian-based tradition, whereby, the idea is that you have to have a single truth. And that truth has to be arrived at somehow, or it has to be revealed from somewhere. We can actually propose different frameworks that allow for people to continue to think differently, but at least to find points whereby our basic human need and our basic human nature ensures that we can actually find goals that we collaborate with. Kwesi Wiredu has written about this in his Cultural Universals and Particulars, but there are many other African thinkers who are thinking in this direction. So what I'm saying is that, as an ethics lab is being created at the University of Cape Town, these are some of the ideas that we can actually begin to work on and contribute and make a substantial contribution from Africa to the global thinking about ethics. And it is about time that we did it. And I'm really happy that the University of Cape Town has taken this initiative and Gentina is leading it. And with seriousness, we can do it. And I'll end with the famous Aluta Continua. Thank you. Over.
Thank you very much, Caesar. And thank you very much to all of our speakers as well. We are going to go into a question and answer session for the rest of the allotted time. And perhaps I can take this opportunity to, kick that process off, first of all, by drawing on some of the salient insights that each of you have provided, and then using that to scaffold out to some questions. So, Amina, thank you very much, for cautioning the techno-optimism that, surrounds a lot of these technologies to sort of foreground the structural conditions like neocolonialism that raise a lot of ethical questions about the development of these technologies. And also, I think an important thing that you mentioned that shouldn't go unacknowledged is your acknowledgement that, this kind of interdisciplinary work is hard. It's not easy for humanities scholars to engage fully with, the technical dimensions of the futures that are being created by these technologies. And so maybe my question to you is to just say more, what has sort of been your experience dealing with, that the demands of interdisciplinarity, and in a way that some of us here at the lab can learn as we also undertake this kind of interdisciplinary work. To Henri, I appreciate your the journey you've taken us through African history to sort of establish how the theme of relevance has been a constant in terms of what counts as relevant knowledge for Africa. And you sort of go about this journey to first of all make the empirical claim that this broader political project, this broader political ethical project of reclaiming African humanity hasn't always engaged questions of science other than Cheikh Anta Diop. So you sort of use that empirical claim to foreground the need to exert epistemological autonomy. And, that itself raises questions about what kind of knowledge comes from Africa, based off your observation that it's not always clear that the research questions that are driving this project are aligned with, the emergent needs of the continent. And so my question is perhaps to get you to say more about, this notion of epistemological autonomy that as an important ethical priority that you're trying to stake a claim for. And finally, to Caesar, I'm going to hold on to your insistence that we affirm citizenship for African knowledge and African scholars. And citizenship has two, dominant traditions, right? So a liberal one that emphasizes individuals' entitlements or group entitlements and rights, but also a Republican tradition that emphasizes responsibilities on account of, being a citizen. And so within those parameters, I'm curious as to what you think are the entailments of this citizenship. So what are African scholars entitled to, but also what are some of the responsibilities? And I noticed you spent more time, at least your presentation, if I was to look at your presentation as an answer to this question, you spend quite a bit of time detailing some of the responsibilities, right? So, saying that some of the work we have to do must be serious. We must demonstrate competence and not repeat. So you gestured to Henri and talking about the mistakes of the past that we are in danger of repeating, whether that's nativism, etc., or even just giving up this project to elites. So I'm just curious as to the entitlements on the one hand and the responsibilities that flow from this conception of citizenship. And to everyone else, if you've got a question, please raise your hand. If you're not comfortable with being archived on video, just use the chat or the question and answer tab. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annie, and thank you to Profs. It was really interesting and very enriching to listen to you both, expanding further the conversation. Anya, in regards to the question that you've asked, it's something that I've also been
I think we might have lost Amina due to the burden of load shedding here in South Africa. So I'm going to ask Henry to maybe give us his response.
Thank you, Anye, and thank you to Caesar and to Amina for your brilliant contributions. The notion of epistemological autonomy that I'm talking about, you know, it's a tricky one to answer, and I'm going to tell you why. Oh, Amina's back. Maybe we want to give the word back to Amina.
Okay. Amina, over to you.
So sorry for interrupting. Okay. I think the first lesson that, or the first insight that I actually got from it was the fact that a lot of social scientists and also anthropologists within interdisciplinary spaces can be very undermined in terms of what do they bring to the table. And I think this perhaps stems from the superiority of STEM or sciences or medicine over other disciplines. And I think the second one has to do with this idea that we are trained within disciplines, and I think sometimes, from what I've encountered, we tend to want to defend the discipline in order to claim that we've come to a better argument in regards to this topic from this perspective. Hence, what I mean to say is that when we are trained by disciplines, we end up not doing the work we need to do, which is using the tools of the discipline to solve a particular issue, as opposed to dealing with much perhaps unnecessary conversations in terms of who's done it better. And I think the third one has, in the biomedical spaces or in health spaces, has to do with the ethical gaze. And I'm particularly speaking to my own experience. When doing an interdisciplinary project in a hospital, for instance, who actually has the right to look at the patient without them knowing, and whether there can be a prior larger project on consent in which patients are briefed about every single person who would be taking part in the project and who would have the right to look at them and to look at their bodies. So I think I'm really thinking about the ethics of perhaps one's gaze, so the ethics of the researcher's gaze when it comes to space in which often bodies shouldn't be, or where bodies should not be taken for granted. Yeah, so I think those are the three ideas that I've been thinking with, which speaks to the question.
Thank you for that. Henry?
Yes, Anye, thank you so much. So you asked me to be more precise around the notion of epistemological autonomy that I have mentioned when I was talking to you about the questions that I have thought about. You see, it's a difficult question to answer because I am really trying to figure out a world that does not exist yet. Because I'm sort of trying to put forward a vision in a way of what I think we should aim for. Maybe I can talk to you about what I see about it that makes it attractive rather than tell you what exactly I mean when I say it. So a part of me is envious, obviously, of the fact that when people sitting in North America, in Europe, and maybe even more in Asia these days, develop scientific problems, there's a certain freedom with which they go to these problems. that does not put the priority of economic development at the forefront of their preoccupations. The type of research that they put forward is not dictated by a desire to contribute to a form of well-being itself that is not rooted in the heart of the society that they come from. Because I feel that very much our scientists, and I mean to say by scientists, I'm really primarily talking about our natural scientists, a lot of the time feel as if they ought to justify their endeavors on the notion or on the back of the notion that what they do will contribute to the development of their societies. But using those words that we've gotten used to, because I mean, this is a rhetoric that exists since the end of the Second World War, and we're almost 80 years after the end of the Second World War. We're so used to that idea that we're supposed to be developing that we no longer question what it actually means. And that is what I would like to question. I'd like to question the fact that that framework is not one that belongs in something that we participated in defining. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that I would like to, I don't like the word regain control, but at least come to a point where the conversation around the definition of the aims of the kinds of questions that we put forward when we practice science should be thought about anew, with the knowledge that we have been practicing science within references and frameworks that are not necessarily in line with, because when you do conduct a scientific project in order to, say, for instance, preserve the health of cocoa trees, say in a country like Côte d'Ivoire, where I'm from, you're absolutely doing something that is in the service of the cocoa farmers, which are a significant part of the population. But the fact that we have cocoa farmers in Côte d'Ivoire itself is something that stems directly out of the fact that the French have colonized Côte d'Ivoire at the end of the 19th century, and that in imitating the British right next door in the Gold Coast, they started to cultivate cocoa. And so what they have questioned is the capacity for our societies to be self-sufficient from a foods perspective. So that problem is there and will remain there until we sit back and think about the fact that we sell cocoa. And so when a scientist participates in maintaining, so I'm just taking this example to show you what I mean. So when a scientist participates in maintaining the health of a cocoa tree, of course, that is an activity that is necessary for the well-being of society as a whole, because it is the real economy. And one cannot overlook that and say, this was a colonial project, therefore it has no validity. But if you want to think about the origin of that idea, and you want to think about where we invest our efforts in terms of our thinking, in terms of our intellectual energy, and in terms of our creativity, with regards to where we would like our societies to go, you almost have to think again about whether this is where you ought to be thinking, where you ought to be investing your energy. And so when I talk of epistemological autonomy, it isn't something that's just going to happen on its own. It's not something that's going to happen at a theoretical level only, but it is something that's going to happen insofar as we're prepared to accept the idea that there are many other elements, many other shifts within society that need to happen at the same time, or that sort of that thinking is something that should project itself onto a world that does not yet exist. I don't know if what I'm saying makes sense.
No, it does. Thank you. I mean, the example you use with the way in which a lot of the pursuit of science is maybe constrained by an imperative of development, for example, and how even though that's necessary, it might also stifle, other questions. I think what is helpful in understanding in the kind of world you're looking to create through the concept. So thank you.
Welcome.
Caesar?
Yeah, thanks. Great. I think, Henri has made a very important point there. If you think about the fact that, Ivory Coast, Ghana, I mean, we are net importers of food, and yet our most fertile land is used in producing things that we do not eat. And we are convinced that this is how to grow our economy. And that means that we really have some serious thinking to do. And this comes back again to the question you asked me about responsibilities and entitlements as the two dimensions of citizenship. And Anya, if you permit me, I'm going to push back on that question. You see, the idea that, you know, we just define this. So citizenship is about entitlements and responsibilities. Who said that? Who created that definition, and who put it that way? And why did they put it that way? If you look at the works of South African philosopher Motsamai Molefe, who writes, I think, from KwaZulu-Natal, he goes on to say that actually, he says that duties trump rights from his analysis. That is a thinking that is worth taking seriously. And I'm not saying we should absolutize any form of thinking, but the fact that we are bearers of rights is because there is some amount of, agency that is also expected of us. Somehow we have also, insisted quite a lot on our entitlements. And then the question then becomes, where are you going with these entitlements? Are you going to use the agency that these entitlements accord you towards a certain idea of a shared good, or you're just going to use them for an individual flourishing, which then goes back to the individual conceptualization of the human person that I challenged? And so this then brings me back again to insist on the point that, if we want to think, either we go radical and go seriously to the end, or we decide to stop somewhere and accept the status quo. Because there are many epistemic assumptions, even to the framework with which we address these problems. And these epistemic assumptions translate into government systems, they translate into law, and they translate into the neoliberal economic models that we're dealing with. And academia is the place that at least we have that space, and we need to defend that space to be able to think and imagine how things could be differently. And really, if you are lucky enough in Africa to be somebody who can actually, be an academic, which means that maybe you don't have to farm or you don't have to work so many hours a day just to be able to live. This is a privilege, and we owe duties to our people, and we have to think. So I come back to the idea that I will insist on the responsibilities, because I think the intelligentsia in Africa, the academics and the leadership have not done justice to our people. Kofi Awona will say, someone is dead, Agoso himself. You've treated your offspring badly. That's the point.
Thank you very much. And yes, I think you are right. At least rhetorically, there has been some attempt to stress social responsibility more than entitlement as part of what it means to be an African intellectual. At least that emphasis has been there. So we have two questions in the chat room. One just being around, what is recognizing this or a possible tension between, this desire for epistemological autonomy, but also, that being in tension with the funding landscape for a lot of health research. And so how does, the funding of health research and where it comes from influence the capacity to assert epistemological autonomy? And the other question just being around whether or not any of you are able to suggest some Afrocentric tools that help us interrogate the issues of power and neocoloniality that and even extraversion that you all have mentioned. Thank you.
I suppose the question of funding versus epistemological autonomy is addressed to me. I mean, my laughter may elicit, may anticipate my answer. I think it is obviously a struggle, but a part of me tends to think that if that question is explored carefully, that notion of having the capacity to define the problems is not something that will be frontally going against the interests of those who fund research. And the reason for this is because there are conversations that are taking place at the moment in the spaces of global health around the notion of decolonization of global health. And those are fiercely fought sort of battleground where even within the community of health practitioners and professionals and thinkers that talk about these questions, there are very serious disagreements as to how the decolonization of global health should sort of manifest itself. So, I mean, just to give you a quick sense of what I mean when I talk about this notion, maybe not everyone's familiar with it. It is the idea that global health as it stands today, so global health being the sets of institutions, practices, and arrangements around providing healthcare at the international level, so that from the WHO down to your infirmary in the rural area of northern Sierra Leone, are part of this apparatus called global health. And so, and the reason why people are thinking about decolonizing global health is because there's a recognition that the birth of what we know to be global health today is located in the colonial era, and that the structures and the funding and I insist on that particular part, are all still very much influenced by those particular realities and that mindset, and even the vision of how the problems are sort of displayed and out of how the problems should be solved is seen to be sort of marked by that colonial gaze to this day. And so because of the fact that this critique does exist and is being sort of put forward by many people in the field of global health, particularly in Africa, there's more and more a realization on the part of organizations that deal with global health, that are involved in the practice of global health, that it is actually in their interest to pay attention to the types of preoccupations that are coming from those that say that they want to be given the opportunity to formulate the problems according to how they see them. And so I'm speaking in this capacity because I have also done work with institutions that are interested in changing their own gaze. So notably the Swiss Tropical and Public Health Institute, which is based here in Basel in Switzerland. And I've done work with them in this particular area. And the question that they were asking them, so this is an institution that is active in many countries in Africa, in Tanzania, in Cote d'Ivoire, and in many other parts of the continent. And one of the questions that they were asking themselves was, how do we formulate projects in such a way that our Global South partners take the lead in defining the problem, instead of us being always the ones that are always going to come up with defining the problem in the first place? Because we recognize implicitly by saying that we recognize that our taking the lead in defining problems has not solved the problems that we've actually set out to solve. So I'm not saying, everything has changed, but I'm saying that there are conversations and there are spaces in which people are seeing that it's not such a clear-cut story, that maintaining that particular frame of reference and that particular type of engagement is not actually in the service of the goals that they have assigned themselves. And so that space opens up to me as a space of possibility. I'm going to leave it there and maybe give an opportunity to my colleagues to speak.
Amina, do you want to go or should I?
I'll go next. Thank you.
Okay, then over to you.
Okay. Perhaps I wish to speak to the first question on how to interact and perceive new emergent technologies. I I think, like Prof. Adhir said, there is agency expected on us. And I really believe we should approach them with criticality, considering that they are not neutral, they are not coming from, I mean, known technology is neutral, and the kind of data it is built with is not neutral. It reflects a particular idea of man, a particular idea of the human, and whether it is dignifying the African subject is very questionable, and remains also an opaque sort of interaction. But I believe this is also a privileged stance where that we actually have the possibility to step back and to think along the dimensions of these interactions with our privacy, with our lives, with our genomes. And I think it's important to ask questions. I think as patients, not as researchers, in hospital spaces, we are our most vulnerable. We just want to get help. We just want to feel better. And so I think the possibility of really sitting down and questioning that interaction or how to approach a particular biotechnology or machine, the possibility becomes limited. But I think as researchers, trying to trace the assemblage that brought the biotechnology to be where it is, and the political economy that fuel it, is an attempt, or perhaps praxis of epistemological autonomy, and being able to actually push back in case in which it is not dignifying, and to actually speak. I think this is where cross-disciplinary work would come, to actually try and attempt to speak along with policies, or to speak back to policies which enable the mobility of these technologies to sit in the places in which we find them.
Okay, so just to come in a bit on the questions, I'm going to give some brief answers to some of the questions that were raised. But there is something, I think there's a bit of, clarification that we need, and conceptual clarification. You see, when we talk about autonomy, this autos and nomos, right? That is giving rules to yourself, right? It is usually as opposed to what we think of a heteronomy, which is rules that are dictated from outside. Famously, Immanuel Kant was the philosopher who spoke a lot about autonomy, and that has been adopted in ethical thinking. But basically, Kant was trying to bring out the idea of ethics within the limits of human reason, so that unlike the medieval period, we don't have to wait for some commandments to come from some divine being outside of us for us to be ethical. So when we apply this to the area of epistemic autonomy, it is not so much a question of, epistemic, reclusion into a silo, but it's a question of having that agency to be able to choose, decide, discern. So epistemic autonomy is not just saying, well, let's close the doors to other forms of knowledge and stick to just one side of knowledge only. I think we need to understand that concept quite clearly. Otherwise, it can actually become a form of epistemic closure. But I don't think what we need is epistemic closure. The second point is, so I think Primus Chi, I saw on, is it Chi, if I pronounce the name, was talking about, and the question of, an example of technological intervention that responds to African aspirations and needs. I just want to point out once again to unpick two words there. He used, the question that appeared in the chat used aspirations and needs. sometimes the two are not the same. And I'll use an example, here. When cell phones were first introduced, in many rural communities, at least in Ghana, there was a whole cell phone supplier called Kasapa, which created community-based cell phones. So there was somebody sitting under an umbrella in the neighborhood. And if I wanted to call Amina, I could call Amina. And since that person knows where Amina lives, you shout and Amina will come and then, answer the phone. So people were becoming more accessible to the telephones because up to then landlines had not existed or anything. But the telephone, the cell phone, still had some form of communitarian dimension. It was shared. But as you see, the thinking behind the idea of a cell phone is a thinking because the technology, that is driving it, and the thinking that is driving that technology is so much that it is centered on individuals. So that model of having a kind of shared community telephone even creates problems with regard to data, with regard to privacy, as we understand it. And what have we done? Over the years, we've now created an aspiration, which is not exactly even a need for everybody, that it is better in those communities not to have any longer these shared community telephones, but to have individual phones. So here you have a form of thinking that is driving even lifestyles and even ways of living. But in communities that are close-knit, where people actually share a lot in life, the idea of having a shared telephone is not problematic at all, because that is how people live anyway, and they share information about themselves. And there is a form of, almost policing within the communities. What maybe the internet introduces is that, once you start going digital, then you have big players coming in who can no longer be policed by the community. And that is the ethical problem. But in communities where people share everything and there is actually very little privacy, there is a lot of ethics there because everybody polices everybody. And for that matter, you have some form of equilibrium that is established. But then you can see how technologies which do not study the behaviors of people or do not respect the traditions and behaviors of people can actually lead gradually to changing even the way people live and the way people interact with each other. And this is why when we're talking about technological innovations, it is always important to have the humanities also accompanying our technological innovations so that we see the real impact on people's lifestyles and whether these are desired impacts or they're going to create even new aspirations that actually perhaps are not even necessary. But that is just to give an example of what and then there's another question there about African bioethical priorities. It is interesting. Actually, there's a book that I co-edited with Frimpong Manso about bioethics in Africa, where we outline the bioethical priorities, I think in a chapter called A Prolegomenon to Bioethics in Africa, and you can find them there. But for example, let's take clinical ethics. Clinical bioethics is not as widespread in Africa as research ethics. Why? Perhaps because clinical ethics comes with research that has funding. Research ethics comes with foreign research that has funding. Yet clinical ethics is very important. And clinical ethics, what framework should you be using? Should we be using the 4 principles of Childress and Beauchamp? Or should we be thinking of African frameworks? So these are some of the bioethical priorities that we have. We have environmental ethics issues within the continent. So there are many, important, bioethical questions that we can be looking at within the continent. And I think, these are the questions that were raised that, I according to my notes, but I don't want to monopolize the time. Yeah.
Thank you. First of all, we just to acknowledge that we are officially out of time, so we do understand if any of you wish to leave the call, just you can do so. But to the extent that the speakers are happy, it's we're also happy to carry on this discussion, taking a few more of the questions in the chat room and then closing off. So if you have to leave, understandable, but I don't get the sense that any of our speakers are that eager to leave, so I'm just going to
I have a maximum of 10 minutes more.
yeah, I'll just read out a couple of questions and then so one question is just about whether there is any, and I think Caesar, it might touch on, you might have answered it briefly about, is there any irony in centering or in adopting autonomy as part of vocabulary in this sort of African-centered vision for bioethics? Is autonomy, autonomy is a cardinal principle in Western bioethics. And if we emphasize autonomy, like in Henri's concept, for example, of epistemological autonomy, are we, do we risk some irony in doing that? And then Cornelius has a question about, just to the extent that what we are engaged in here is a politics of knowledge production. How do we protect against elite capture? So we obviously want to proliferate spaces for Africans to come together and think about this, scholars from Africa to come together and think about these issues. But, which should we be also paying attention to which Africans end up, getting to exercise some leadership in the conversation, and to what extent, much like the decolonial process ended up in elite capture from a political perspective, what are the dangers of, or what are the dangers of elite capture in an epistemological perspective, and how can we mitigate that? So over to you.
This is Henri speaking. Can I say something to the irony of the centrality of autonomy in Western bioethics as being something that one should be aware of? Again, I'm not a professional philosopher or an ethicist by training. I just want to say that to start, my answer. But I also want to say this. I think the desire for, and I'm taking another example here, the desire for independence or for a freedom in terms of asserting the political sovereignty of our states. Now, should we look at that as being something ironic because this is something that some Western countries have put forward in their own history, talking about themselves? Is that not something legitimate for us to aspire to look for? So I want to say that the fact that autonomy has the central character that it has in Western thinking, to me, does not contradict the fact that we may display a similar desire for autonomy ourselves. I don't see it as something that is, quote unquote, tainted by the fact that it has this central character to ways in which bioethics is thought of out of Kantian philosophy as such. I think it is up for debate, as a matter of fact. Thank
you. Yeah. Anyway, just to continue on that point, yeah, we need to, and here Henri is as a historian has already pointed out, one of the issues that surrounded the birth of bioethics was the experience of the Second World War, the Nuremberg trials, the experiments in the Nazi concentration camps, and the drive for greater liberty that surrounded the late 1960s, and bioethics came about, and some other abuses, in science and all that. And, so autonomy in bioethics is kind of conceived as a way of protecting individuals against forms of paternalism. And you see, this is where I think it is not a question of an either or, but both. Because you see, paternalism in the first place is not bad if it is exercised well. We are all children of paternalism. None of us chose the names we have. None of us chose even the countries or the language that we speak. Our parents chose for them, and that's pure hardline paternalism. And we're not taking our parents to court for that, right? Now, paternalism becomes bad when the pater, the father figure, starts using that power that has been given to them, no longer for the interest of the filius of the child, but for self-interest. And that is when paternalism becomes problematic. So in research or in clinical context, when paternalism becomes a problem, we decide to respond by giving greater autonomy to the patient or to the research participant. Fair and well. But what we should not stop doing is asking why the pater has become one who is no longer acting as a good pater. So autonomy, yes, but we need to look at the conditions that actually make it in such a way that this form of paternalism is being used in a way that is not in the interest of the subjects. And that means we need to start asking structural and systemic questions, because just addressing one side of the problem is only a partial solution. Which is why I think, contributions of the African way of thinking can enrich the discourse. And here, there are some concepts that some of us have even tried to put on the table. For example, in clinical context, one of the things you find is the importance that people almost want to generate a kind of empathic humanism. When you go into many hospitals across Africa, people call the nurses and the doctors, papa or dad doctor. They want to establish almost familiar relationships. Why? Because to some extent, this is what generates trust. And we shouldn't kill that by over-professionalizing that, because, the healthcare context is not just a question of, a biomedical context, but it's all a question of a healing context. So how can we bring this form of ethics into our discourse as well? So for me, it's a question of broadening the discourse and enriching the concepts. Somebody also mentioned the funding coming from abroad. And yeah, I think, Henri addressed that. But let's also not forget that, the African unions actually signed an agreement that African countries will contribute 1% of their GDP to R&D, development and research. And South Africa is quite far advanced in that, but many other countries are not even halfway there. And they are not doing it. Yet they are using money to buy luxury goods for politicians. So these are things that from within the continent we need to challenge. Because, if we keep relying on external funders, yes, the funders can be sensitive to negotiating and they are engaging with our interests, but the internally generated funding for research cannot be forgotten. Elite capture, I think, what can I say about that? But that we only just have to look at the experience of the independence movements across Africa. In many countries, actually gaining independence from the colonial powers was a form of elite capture by an African elite, which did not know that it was it was almost secretly being captured by the former colonizer. And I think Amina's discourse about healthcare in Morocco actually illustrates that point. And those are the mechanisms that somehow we need to break. And then there's a question about ChatGPT, which fishes with ethical Ubuntuism from mega data that belongs to everyone. I think ChatGPT really opens up a new era of ethics, and we need to start thinking. And this is where, and the beauty of, innovations like this is that they force us to think a little bit further. The whole idea of, ownership of knowledge attached to the genius, which is what is the underlying philosophy even of patents and IP rights that have generated so many problems in global health recently, is linked to that. Like, is the knowledge that I have really only mine? No, I depend on so many people. But we've gone to such a privatization of knowledge that ChatGPT is going to push us to be able to start asking questions about that. And I would say, good luck, ChatGPT. Make our ethical system suffer. so that we begin to rethink again. And this whole idea is not that old. The whole idea of, an individual being an owner of an idea, absolutely, it's only about 300 years old. And it's about time we rethink it, and I'm happy to rethink it.
On that note, I would like to bring the webinar to an end. Above all, very grateful to our speakers, not only for their time, but for the really provocative questions that they've put on the table. We'll have many more of these seminars throughout the year. This one has been recorded and is going to be shared. And if you want to, we're still working on our web environment at the moment, but you can contact me if you'd like to, be part of our events going forward. You want to be kept in the loop, or maybe you also have an idea, that you'd like to present going forward. But we're very grateful that, not just the speakers gave up the time, but the rest of you who came online to listen. And, we really hope over time to grow a vibrant community of scholars from Africa and elsewhere, who really are excited by the opportunity to engage with frontier science, but also want to place Africa as a context and point of reference in that engagement. And I'm sure you'll all agree that our speakers have put us on the right path towards that task. So thank you, Amina, Caesar, Henri, and thank you to everyone else. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you, Annie.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank
Bye,
you,
everyone.
Professor.
Thank you so much.